My name is Tina, and I can't quite recall the exact moment I realized I was different from my sister, Sarah. Maybe it happened when I was 7 and she was 4. I remember watching her play with dolls while I helped Mom prepare dinner. Or perhaps that awareness had always been there, dating back to the days when I stood on a bench to reach the kitchen sink, washing dishes while peeking out the window at other kids playing outside. Tina, is your homework done? Mom would ask every day after school, her voice taut, like a tightly stretched string. Yes, Mom, I'd reply, already tying one of the 2 oversized aprons she'd given me on my 6th birthday around my waist. A practical gift, as she had called it at the time, useful, she said. Now help me with dinner, Mom would add, before turning to Sarah in a much gentler tone. Sarah, sweetheart, you can go play. Sarah would cheerfully toss her head, her dark braids bouncing as she ran off. Meanwhile, I would rise on my tiptoes again, trying to reach the kitchen counter. Even back then, at 7 years old, I already understood. Complaining was not an option. She's just little, Mom would say every time I tried to voice my frustration. You're the older sister, you have to help. Dad was no different. Every evening, when he came home from work, he would ruffle Sarah's hair affectionately as she showed him her drawings, usually made during the time she was supposed to be doing her homework. Then he'd turn to me and ask, with a slight squint, "So, how were your grades today, Tina?" Not, "How was your day?" or "What did you learn?" Always just grades. Only grades. I'd look at him and silently think that was probably the bare minimum he expected from me. Our house was small and modest, a 2-story home in a typical middle-class suburb. Friends lived nearby, but I rarely saw them after school. There was always something that needed my attention: dishes, laundry, helping Sarah with her homework. Although Sarah rarely paid much attention to hers, preferring instead to draw or make up games. I remember one particular day. I was 10 years old, and I'd won first place in a regional math competition. My parents beamed with pride as the teacher praised me. "You've done an incredible job raising Tina," said Mrs. Monty. "Her love for learning is truly remarkable." Mom and Dad exchanged proud glances. "We've always encouraged her to read," Mom replied, her hand resting on my shoulder. But I wanted to tell Mrs. Monty the truth, that late nights with a flashlight under the blanket had become my habit because there was no time to study during the day. My time was consumed by chores. The only encouragement I got was knowing that any mistake would bring my parents disappointment. Instead, I just smiled and nodded, like the good daughter I was supposed to be. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in the hallway, folding paper airplanes out of her failed math test. No one said a word. No one ever did. Sometimes, I caught Sarah watching me with a smirk, especially when she managed to do something that might get me into trouble. "You're just jealous," she told me once when I was 12 and she was 9. "Because Mom and Dad love me more." I remember standing in our shared bathroom, water still dripping from my hands, as I stared at my reflection in the mirror. "That's not true," I said, but deep down, I couldn't help wondering if it was. By then, I was already exhausted. School, chores, the constant pressure, it all blurred together into a monotonous rhythm where I was always one step ahead but never far enough to feel free. Sarah knew how to use that to her advantage. "Why do you care so much, Tina? You'll just end up doing it for me anyway," she'd say whenever I tried to get her to help. Her smile, that infuriating smirk that made my insides clench, always confirmed the truth of her words. And she was right. It always ended the same way. "Tina, why isn't Sarah's homework done yet?" Mom's voice would inevitably ring out from the kitchen doorway, her hands planted on her hips. I'd try to explain, to say that Sarah wouldn't listen, that she didn't care. But Mom would just frown and shake her head disapprovingly. "You're the older sister. You're supposed to help her." As if it was my duty. So, in the end, I'd just do it myself while Sarah sat at the table, engrossed in YouTube videos. It was easier than enduring yet another lecture about my responsibilities. Every Friday, Sarah would get her $20 in allowance. She'd proudly show off her new accessories or buy something delicious in the school cafeteria. And me? I'd get $5, if I got any at all. Usually, it was accompanied by a heavy sigh and a comment about how money doesn't grow on trees. The turning point came when I turned 16. I couldn't stand watching Sarah flaunt her new clothes, enjoy the latest gadgets, while I was stuck wearing hand-me-down uniforms and couldn't even afford lunch. Everything changed the day I saw the "Help Wanted" sign in the window of Joe's cafe. Joe, the owner of the cafe, was a rough around the edges but kind man. He'd often serve me hot chocolate when I stopped by with my textbooks after school. When I asked him if I could work there, he just smiled. "The job's tough, kid. Think you can handle it?" I handled it. The work at the cafe was exhausting, serving tables, clearing dirty dishes, calming unhappy customers. But it was my place. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd earned my own money. My first paycheck, $850 for a month of part-time work, became a symbol of freedom for me. Naively, I left it on the desk in my room, thinking my parents would be happy for me. But that evening, Mom called me into the kitchen. The check lay on the table between her and Dad. Mom looked disappointed, and Dad's expression was stern. "Why didn't you tell us you got a job?" he asked, his voice unusually firm. "I just got paid," I mumbled, not understanding what the problem was. Mom didn't let me finish. "If you live in our house and eat our food, you'll give us half of your paycheck. That's only fair." I stood there, stunned. I tried to argue, but it was pointless. In the end, I gave in, handing over half of my hard-earned money. But the worst came a week later. Sarah burst into our room wearing brand-new Nike sneakers, her face beaming with excitement. "Look what Mom and Dad bought me," she said with a smile, twirling around. "I guess your job is actually useful." That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried. It was the final straw. I made a firm decision. I was leaving this house. College would be my ticket to freedom. My parents had always made it clear that there would always be money for Sarah. For me? Never. They never discussed my future plans but constantly talked about her potential. I threw myself into studying like never before. Every spare minute was spent preparing, researching scholarships, and writing essays. Graduation day was the confirmation that I had made the right choice. It was yet another performance of the perfect family. Mom dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and Dad stood with his chest puffed out proudly. The school principal, smiling, called my academic achievements exceptional. I sat in my blue gown, looking at my parents from afar, knowing that a completely different life awaited me. I watched as they, as always, accepted the praise, nodding and smiling as if my accomplishments were the result of their efforts. Other parents approached them, shaking their hands, congratulating them on their wonderful parenting. No one had any idea that behind my smile were years of isolation and silent pressure. No one knew that I had already received acceptance letters from several universities and was secretly planning my future. I submitted the applications on my own. For weeks, I checked the mailbox, carefully intersecting the letters before anyone else could see them. Each acceptance letter felt like a small key to a door I had been trying to open my entire life. But one letter stood out, the one from Riverside University. A full scholarship. Free housing and an additional stipend for textbooks. It was the perfect offer, and the university was just 4 hours away, far enough to feel free, but close enough to come back if necessary. I kept it a secret, waiting for the right moment to share it. That moment came during the dinner Mom prepared for my graduation. She made pasta, calling it my favorite, though she didn't even know that it wasn't true. We sat at the table. Mom, serving herself another portion, finally looked up. Tina, she began with a bright smile, have you thought about what you'll do next? I opened my mouth to tell them about Riverside, but Mom continued before I could answer. I talked to Joe yesterday. He said he'd be happy to take you on full-time. Isn't that wonderful? You could make more money and help out with the family expenses. I took a deep breath. I've been accepted to Riverside University, I said. Full scholarship. I start in the fall. The seconds of silence that followed felt like an eternity. Mom's fork fell from her hand, clattering loudly against her plate. Dad's face turned an alarming shade of red. When Mom spoke, her voice was sharp. College? Out of state? What about your family? What about helping Sarah? I've spent my entire life helping Sarah, I said quietly. But this is something I need to do for myself. Dad stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor. He didn't say a word, just left the room, slamming the door behind him. Look what you've done, Mom hissed. Sarah just sat there with a faint smirk on her face, as if she were already imagining how she would enjoy her newfound freedom. My decision had shattered the fragile balance in our household. The summer that followed was a kind of torture. I worked at the cafe, came home, handed over half my paycheck, and stayed in my room, avoiding everyone. Mom and Dad barely spoke to me. Any conversations were purely practical, about bills, groceries, and what needed to be bought. When August came, I packed my things into 2 suitcases. No tearful goodbyes, no family photos on the front porch. Dad didn't help load the car, like I had seen other parents do for their kids. All I had was a bus ticket and my dreams of a different life. The morning of my departure, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen. I'm leaving, I said. Mom kept washing the dishes without turning around. All right, she said dryly. Dad rustled his newspaper, and Sarah didn't even look up from her phone. Not a flicker of interest. Not a hint of regret. The bus ride took 4 hours, and with every mile, I felt the weight I'd been carrying for years slowly lift off my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I could breathe freely. My dorm room was tiny but clean, and my roommate, Jenny, was everything I'd ever wanted in a sister. She was genuinely interested in my life and supported me in every way. I threw myself into my studies with abandon. Every finance class brought me a sense of joy and liberation. I spent hours learning investment strategies, analyzing markets, and savoring every moment. Now everything depended on me. My professors praised my work ethic, and for the first time in my life, there was no one who could take credit for my achievements. My successes were mine alone, and it filled me with a pride I had never known before. Still, the occasional phone calls home always brought me back to reality. The pattern was unchanging. Mom would talk about Sarah, her dreams of becoming a model or something else, always emphasizing how important it was to give her time to find herself. We don't want her to rush into anything she doesn't like, Mom would say. Dad, on the other hand, avoided mentioning my achievements altogether. If I tried to share my successes, being top of my class, making the dean's list, he would just nod, as if it were a given, and steer the conversation back to Sarah. When Sarah graduated from high school, Mom called specifically to tell me about it. She didn't ask me to attend the ceremony, and honestly, I doubted I'd have been welcome. It turned out Sarah's grades weren't good enough to get into college, but Mom, in her usual carefree tone, said, "We told her not to worry. The right job will come along." I couldn't help but think about how drastically different our lives were. I'd been working since I was 16, giving half my earnings to the family. Meanwhile, Sarah was exploring her options and spending her time dreaming of a modeling career. By that time, I had already graduated from university with honors. My family didn't come to my graduation. Instead, Jenny's family hugged me and threw me a celebration. 2 weeks after receiving my diploma, I returned to my hometown and started working as a junior financial analyst at one of the top firms, Reynolds and Associates. My starting salary was more than what my parents earned combined. When I rented my first apartment, it felt like a true symbol of freedom. For the first time, I could breathe deeply. But less than a month later, my parents invited me over for dinner. "We've heard you're doing well," Dad said, looking at me over his glasses. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," Mom added. But soon, the conversation took its usual turn. Dad started talking about rising property taxes, which had become unmanageable. Mom sighed and complained about utility bills. I realized where this was heading and offered to help. At first, it was $500. Then it became $1,000. The more I gave, the more they expected. When I was promoted to senior analyst, I made the mistake of telling Mom. She immediately scheduled a dinner, and I went, fully aware that the conversation would inevitably lead to money. "We're so proud of you," Mom said at the table, but her tone, as always, betrayed her hidden intentions. Dad lamented his reduced work hours. Mom sighed again, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper to show the size of their utility bills. It all seemed dramatic until I glanced at Sarah, sitting in designer jeans, completely engrossed in her phone. The words caught in my throat. I wanted to say that a 22-year-old woman, who could spend hours filming dance videos for the internet, was perfectly capable of filling out a job application. But I stayed silent. And then Mom said the words that broke me. "You know, Tina," she began, patting my hand gently, "we've been thinking. You're spending so much on your apartment. Why don't you move back home? It would save you money, and we could help each other out." The world I'd worked so hard to build suddenly started to crack. I felt like I was 16 again, watching my hard-earned money disappear into someone else's pockets. The thought of giving up my quiet apartment, my independence, my space, made my stomach twist. But when I opened my mouth to say no, I saw the familiar guilt-inducing looks on my parents' faces. "All right," I heard myself say. Their faces lit up with joy, as if I'd given them the greatest gift. A week later, I moved back into my childhood bedroom. The room felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just outgrown it. As I unpacked my suitcases, I laid out my terms immediately. I would help with bills and groceries, but I would no longer cook or clean. I'd done enough of that growing up. Mom agreed too quickly. The next day, I found out why. "What do you mean I have to clean?" Sarah screeched, her voice ringing with indignation. "I don't even know how to use a vacuum cleaner." "It's about time you learned," Mom replied calmly, her tone surprisingly soft. "Tina helps us financially, so you can help around the house." I stood in the doorway of my room, watching as Sarah stomped around, barely running the vacuum over the carpet while muttering something about the injustice of the world. Later, she posted passive-aggressive Instagram stories about forced labor and unfair treatment. I just smirked. She was still living off my money, eating food I paid for, and using utilities I covered. Somehow, though, my equivalent of rent never seemed to ease my parents' financial struggles. The least Sarah could do was learn how to clean a bathroom. "Tina, have you noticed how shabby the house looks?" Mom asked casually one morning over her coffee. "Yeah, the paint is peeling," Dad immediately chimed in. "And the plumbing in the bathroom is long overdue for an upgrade." I already knew where this was going. After a few days of hints, they finally addressed me directly, asking if I could help with renovations. Of course, that meant paying for everything. In the end, I spent about $30,000 on repairs. I repainted the house, updated the plumbing, replaced the carpets with hardwood floors, installed modern kitchen appliances, and landscaped the yard. Even the exterior now looked pristine. The house had transformed into something straight out of a glossy magazine. Mom couldn't contain her pride when calling relatives. "You have to come over and see what we've done to the house." We, of course. For Christmas dinner, she invited everyone she could possibly reach. It was going to be the biggest gathering in years. "Everyone will see how well we're doing," Mom said as she set out the festive dishes. I ended up spending a fortune again, buying gifts for all the guests, including a new laptop for Sarah, which she'd been hinting at for months. When Christmas arrived, the house was packed with people marveling at the renovations, the tree, and the food, all of which, naturally, I had paid for. Sarah, upon unwrapping a brand new iPhone from our parents, let out a squeal so loud it could probably be heard 3 houses down. My gift from them? A bath set from the nearest drugstore, clearly a last-minute purchase, as if they'd only remembered me after everyone else had been accounted for. I didn't say anything. I just forced a strained smile and thanked them for the gift. Then I silently watched as everyone else opened the expensive items I had bought, soaking in the joy and excitement that seemed to belong exclusively to them. No one even noticed the difference. The party, the house, the gifts, all of it had been funded by me, yet they acted as though it had all magically appeared. When the guests finally settled down and the noise subsided a bit, Mom cleared her throat to make an announcement. "Linda and her kids will be staying with us for a few days," she said, gesturing toward her friend from out of state. Linda smiled warmly, and her 2 teenage children looked tired from the long journey. "That's nice," I said, already picturing how cramped the house was going to feel. But Mom wasn't finished. "Tina, you'll need to move your things out of your room. Linda and her kids will stay there." I froze. The words didn't register immediately. "Excuse me?" I finally managed, my voice wavering slightly. "It's only for a few days," Mom added, as if that changed anything. "They can stay in the living room," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "The couch can be unfolded, and I can bring out the air mattress." "Don't be ridiculous." Mom snapped. "There are guests. We can't make them sleep in the living room. That would be uncomfortable." The irony of her words hit me like a slap in the face. "And what about my comfort?" I asked, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "Did you even think about that?" Dad waved a hand dismissively. "Stop making a scene. Just pack your things and move to the living room. It's not a big deal." I looked around. My eyes fell on the house I had renovated, the Christmas tree decorated with ornaments I had bought, the guests enjoying food I had paid for. Something inside me snapped. "Why can't they stay in Sarah's room?" I asked. A heavy silence filled the room. Sarah's head shot up from her new iPhone, her mouth falling open in indignation. "I can't believe you would even suggest that," she hissed. Mom and Dad exchanged a look, as if I'd proposed something utterly monstrous. "That's completely out of the question," Mom said firmly. "Why?" I pressed. "Why is it okay to displace me but not her?" Mom's face turned red as she glared at me. "You're embarrassing me in front of my friend," she hissed. "We didn't raise you to act like this. If you can't behave properly in this house," Dad said sharply, "then maybe you shouldn't be here at all. Get out." Mom shrieked. "Get out until you learn some manners." I looked at them, at their angry, self-righteous faces. Mom, seething with indignation. Dad, wearing his stern expression. Sarah, not even bothering to hide the triumphant smile on her face. None of them remembered that everything they used, including the roof over their heads and the food on their table, was paid for by me. But I didn't remind them. Instead, I silently went upstairs to my room. My room, which apparently now belonged to anyone but me. With steady hands, I began packing my suitcase. Afterward, I found a hostel on the edge of town that had one room left and booked it immediately. 20 minutes later, I walked down the stairs I had paid to repair and repaint, my suitcase thudding against the floor. No one even looked in my direction. No one tried to stop me. No one said a word. Sarah just smirked, still engrossed in her new iPhone, and my parents seemed convinced I'd return once I'd cooled off. But I knew I wouldn't. The hostel I arrived at that Christmas night was modest, a tiny room with a lumpy mattress and a bathroom at the end of the hall. And yet, that cramped space felt like freedom. It was mine, if only temporarily. I spent New Year's Eve there with a box of Chinese takeout and my laptop, scrolling through apartment listings. Within a few days, I found a one-bedroom apartment in a modern complex on the other side of town, far from my parents' neighborhood. With every click of the mouse, I felt myself detaching from the past. For the first few days after I left, my phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages. Mom, Dad, Sarah. I ignored them all. I furnished the new apartment exactly how I'd always dreamed. I bought furniture I liked, painted the walls in colors I chose, and created a space that was entirely mine. 2 weeks later, I moved in. One day, when I didn't check the caller ID, I accidentally answered a call from Mom. It was a mistake I wouldn't make again. "It's time for you to pay the utility bills," she said sharply, skipping any preamble. I sighed. "Linda and her kids have left," she continued. "You can come back now. Your room is waiting." I almost laughed. "No, Mom," I replied quietly. She fell silent, as though she were truly processing the meaning of my answer. Then she repeated herself, as if she hadn't heard me the first time. "What do you mean?" "I mean no. I'm not coming back, and I won't be paying your bills anymore." There was a moment of stunned silence before the explosion came. Mom started screaming, accusing me of being ungrateful. She listed everything they'd supposedly done for me, how I was abandoning them in their time of need. "You've shown me that all I was to you was a checkbook," I interrupted her calmly when she paused to take a breath. "Well, this checkbook is closed. Don't call me unless you're ready to treat me with respect." I hung up before she could start shouting again. In the days that followed, the calls and messages escalated. Dad left voicemail after voicemail about family duty. Sarah sent passive-aggressive texts about how much she was suffering because of my selfishness. Mom alternated between crying and blaming me for tearing the family apart. I blocked them all. Weeks turned into months. I focused on my work and earned another promotion. I started attending yoga classes, met new friends, and built a life that felt like my own for the first time. Through mutual acquaintances, I occasionally heard updates about my parents. They were struggling to make ends meet. Sarah, for the first time in her life, had gotten a job as a cashier at a supermarket. Apparently, she was terrible at it. She complained about standing all day and called in sick whenever she could. My parents, meanwhile, told anyone who would listen about their ungrateful eldest daughter. They spun tales about how much they'd supported my education and career, two things they'd never contributed to, and how I'd abandoned them the moment I found success. Some people believed them. Let them. The truth is, I spent 25 years trying to be who they wanted me to be, the obedient daughter, the family's financial safety net. But now it was time to be myself. The irony is that I'm grateful to them, not for the years of manipulation and control, but for that final Christmas night. Sometimes, you have to lose everything to find yourself.